Hello, everybody. My name is Alex Wiseman, and I am excited to talk to you today about how to analyze your educational case study. We're going to be using a lot of education-related case studies as a way to understand the topic of educational leadership and educational policy and organizational leadership, change management. You can put all those things together for a big bag of fun. But we're going to talk for the next few minutes specifically about the case studies and how to approach them. So think of this as very much of a how-to video. We're explaining how you're going to analyze them. And I want to point out credit where, or give credit where credit is due. This is very much based on this right here, Steven Silverman's How to Analyze a Business Case Study. You can visit this YouTube video and you will see a lot of similarities to what I'm going to present you here. So I want to thank Steven Silverman for providing that template and also acknowledge that he based his work on Hammond's 2002 Learning by the Case Method article from the Harvard Business School. You'll see a lot of business school and business program related work on case studies. It's a very popular method in business and the law. But we're using it for education. We're going to use it well, I hope. So how do you get the most from cases? So a couple things to remember. One is just plan on spending some time preparing. It's going to be 2 to 3 hours per case. When you get these cases, they may be a couple of pages, they may be a lot of pages, but plan to spend on the whole thing a couple of hours at least, just absorbing the information and thinking about the information and preparing your response to the information that's in those cases. You should read that case very carefully. I'm going to give you some advice on how to do that, starting with reading it first very quickly and then very carefully. You should try to understand the different concepts that are being exhibited in the cases. In a lot of the stuff you'll hear me talk about will be using Bowman and Deal's Reframing Organizations as a key text. So I would like for you to sort of understand and analyze using the frames of the Bowman and Deal work, where they talk about the structural and the human resource and the political and the symbolic frames. So spend some time thinking about that. When you come to class or when you're interacting with your colleagues in the seminar or the class period, make sure that you participate, and your preparation will have you certainly ready for that. Be interactive, be active in your interaction. And that means that, yes, it's good to listen and to absorb, but you need to be actively engaged, because not only are we studying leadership, but we're also engaging in becoming leaders. And you can't do that passively. You have to do that actively. So be vocal. Share your opinion, share your perspective, share your understanding, share your analysis, share any insights you might have, right? That's the share part. I'd like for you to also, during the prepare and the participation time, make sure that you are relating what's in the case to your own experience and expertise as much as possible. So if it is a case study that's about a high school in rural New Mexico, I could relate to that. I was a high school teacher in rural New Mexico for several years. If it's something a little more far afield, if it's a case study related to a primary school classroom in Peru, I couldn't relate probably as closely, but I have had some experiences both as a student and as an educator in primary level classrooms. I've never been to Peru, but I do understand some of the cultures and cultural factors that are at play there. So use your own experience, use your own expertise. For example, I'll be able to relate very closely with teacher leadership and with administrative leadership sorts of cases, because I've had those kinds of experiences, and I have some expertise in those areas. You latch on to whatever is most relevant to your experience. And by that, I mean you should personalize it. Think about your own organization, whether that be a school or a university or a nonprofit or an NGO or whatever it is. Use your organization as your link. Think about how the case that's being presented might also happen in your context, whatever that might be. And then finally, as you're working through these cases, I want you to remember and be conscious of the fact that you are enhancing your own understanding of how leadership in organizations works, about how change can be both facilitated and managed, and how you can be a part of that leadership and change process. So be conscious of that. I laugh when I see this written here because you could think that I mean just stay awake, but it's more than that, right? You not only have to be awake, but you have to be aware of the kind of learning that you're engaging in. So use that awareness to focus your attention on the points of the cases that are most relevant to your own experience and expertise. Use that consciousness, that awareness to improve your own leadership skills and the kinds of things that you're doing in your organization to facilitate change, right? Learning is a very engaged process, and in order to get the most from these cases, in order to learn the most from these cases, you have to be the one to really take control of the process. Me or whoever your instructor is will facilitate the process, but you've got control of it. So how do you approach a case? Well, the first thing you should do is read the case quickly, like you read maybe a magazine article, or if you have ever taken a study skills course or something like that. Use the technique of skimming at first. You can do that by looking at the first and last paragraphs or the first and last sentences of each paragraph within the case. Just try to get a sense for what the case is about, what the context is, what some of the data is that you're going to see in there, what the main issue is in the case, which will lead to the type of case, that sort of thing. Next, as you're reading it quickly or skimming through it, look for data. Where is there data provided? And that could be data about many things. That could be data about the specific situation that's highlighted in the case. That could be data about the context, which could be demographic, could be cultural, it could be social, it could be organizational, it could be administrative, it could be political. There are lots of different ways that you can find the data other than the sort of overt, obvious data about the unique situation that is perhaps in the title of the case or something like that. Be aware of what kind of data is being provided. Is it qualitative data, meaning that it is narrative or it is verbal or it is non-numerical type of data? Or is it quantitative, meaning that it is indeed numerical data that is demonstrated in terms of percentages or is displayed in tables or is some sort of quantitative data that you have available? Think about how the data could be useful to you as you try to make a decision or you try to come to a conclusion or you try to make a recommendation as you're analyzing the case. And how could you actually analyze the data further? So lots of times in cases, data will be provided that is just descriptive. It's just sort of explaining this is what it is, this is what it looks like, right? So it's very obvious and it's usually very simple. But could you take that data and perform some sort of additional analysis with it? Maybe you could find on the most basic sort of descriptive level, you could find the average or the mean of a set of numbers if it's quantitative data. Or if it's qualitative data, you could look for keywords and maybe think about what some of the codes might be that are displayed in a particular document that's given as data. And then finally, try to identify the type of case that's being given to you. Is that a problem-related case, a decision-related case, or an evaluation-related case? And I'll talk about what those are a little bit more in a minute. Next, I want to talk about how to approach the case. As you're reading it, read it carefully and take notes about the case. And I'm going to give you some suggestions for what kinds of things you can take notes on. So first of all, you want to make sure that you understand the what and the when. So study the situation. What is happening and when is it happening? What's the situation being faced in the case? What is the problem or the decision or the evaluation that is either taking place in the case or is explicitly asked for as a part of the case, right? Be aware of what that is. Pay a lot of attention to context around the situation. The context is going to be very important because the kinds of decisions you might make in a large minority population, rural school in, a particular part of the state or the country or the local community is going to be very different than a small majority race or ethnicity, high socioeconomic status school in a city somewhere. So you really have to take control of your understanding of the situation by studying the situation itself, including the what, the when, the context, and some of the explicit things that are being asked about or focused on. Next, and this you're going to see this come up over and over and over again, I want you to develop hypotheses specifically using Bolman and Deal's 4 frames. This is the why and the how. And before I talk about the hypotheses themselves, I want you to think about the why and the how. And I'd like for you to, if nothing else, instead of strict sort of research hypotheses, I would love for you even just to create questions or statements that either answer why or answer how something happens, or if they're questions, they use the words why and how to ask questions about that. Why does X happen? How does X happen? How does the principal in this school influence the student achievement of 5th graders? I mean, you could go a lot of different ways. That's a sort of an off-the-cuff example, but you get where I'm going with that. I want you then to develop hypotheses about what's happening using Bolman and Deal's 4 frames in response to your why and how, either questions or statements in response to those questions. And so you want to think about the structural, the human resource, the political, and the symbolic frames and create hypotheses about what's happening based on those frames. Now, this is not the video where we're going to talk about the characteristics of each of those frames. That's certainly something that we'll be addressing in a lot of detail, both in the reading and in the seminar class. But know that you will be expected to develop hypotheses looking through each of those frames based on the situation and your statement of the situation. Think of it this way. In a lot of ways, you're trying to propose what are some potential causes behind whatever situation there is. Now, if you are more of a researcher than you are a practitioner, you might have some trouble with the word cause here because we are taught as researchers to avoid making causal assumptions. Causal assumptions can get you in a lot of trouble because they're usually just that. They're assumptions. They're not really causes. So you're thinking about what are potential causes, but you're thinking about them in terms of what are the factors that are contributing to this result, right? If the word cause bothers you, as it would if you're a researcher, think about what are the factors that are contributing to the result or contributing to the situation. And that's good enough. As you're reading carefully and taking notes, think about proof and action. So you're going to be looking for, again, this is another word if you're a researcher you're going to have trouble with, the idea of proof. I think another way to think about this is evidence. What is evidence that's available? It's very hard to find all the proof, but you can find a significant amount of evidence. And what is the evidence that you can analyze or extract from the case? Now, this is the data, right? You're looking for the data. And remember that data can be quantitative or qualitative or a mix of both. That's the evidence that you're going to be able to use. It might be in narrative form. It might be part of the story because cases are almost always written in a narrative format so that you're following along in kind of education leadership related story. There's usually not a happy ending in the cases, unfortunately, but that's why we do them, so that we can figure out how to make it a happy ending. And you want to figure out how you are going to analyze the data, or how you might analyze the data in the case, considering your hypotheses in one of these 4 frames. And then try to identify recommended actions from the perspective of each frame, or if we're in a week where we're only thinking about 1 frame, or a day when we're only thinking about 1 frame, do it from that frame's perspective in particular. Although you always want to try to balance them out, because these don't happen in a vacuum, right? This one, the structural relates to human resource, which relates to symbolic, which relates to political, which relates to structural. And you can do it this way as well, right? They all relate to one another, and all the arrows go in every direction. So think about how all these frames are interacting, but try to identify recommended actions from the perspective of each frame. So you would have a maximum of 4 recommended actions, and there might be some overlap. So you could think about it like a Venn diagram, where there's a lot of overlap between each of those 4 frames and the recommended actions. It's going to be very important to evaluate alternatives to your recommended actions. So first of all, think about which option or options either has or have the highest likelihood of success. In other words, addressing, resolving, deciding whatever the outcome that the case calls for. Which of your recommended action options has the highest likelihood of success? And then what are the weaknesses of those recommended actions, and how might you overcome those weaknesses? Now, I just want to point out that this part is a challenge. There's no question about it. Finding the proof and making recommended actions is absolutely a challenge. This part, evaluating alternatives, specifically identifying the weaknesses of the choices that you've made and how you're going to overcome them, that is a key. Leaders do that. Leaders see through the mist, so to speak, to understand and identify what's happening, what are the challenges to that, and how to maybe get around it, resolve it, avoid it, whatever it might be. There are many assignments, or there are several assignments in this class where I'm going to ask you to do some writing related to your case analysis. And so I wanted to point out some ways that you could think about writing up your framing case analysis. And I'm using the word framing because we're talking about Bowman and Deal's 4 frames. First thing you want to think of is stating the conclusion first. In other words, what is the outcome to address the situation in the case? What are you recommending? That's what we were talking about on the last one, right? What is the recommended action? So start with the end. Start with what you recommend happen. Remember, we're trying to be very proactive about this. This is not something where you're going to, take 4 pages to build this up in a lot of flowery language to the eventual conclusion. We want to know what the conclusion is right off the bat, because we don't have a lot of time in the day usually to do all this optional reading. Instead, we want to cut to the point, because everything that we're trying to do should be driven by some sort of action or decision or problem solving or evaluation or something like that. So state the conclusion first, and then you want to make the case. Discuss the data and the analysis that supports your conclusion. So what evidence have you found, qualitative or quantitative, either that was explicitly present in the case, or that you did a little further analysis, either by coding or describing or some manipulation of the data in order to understand the situation a little further? And how does that evidence support your conclusion, support this? Then you want to build a story from the data to make your case. There is a lot of evidence that narrative is the way to make a point, more than bullets, more than what I'm doing right now, quite frankly. If I were telling you a story about how someone framed their case analysis, and these are the ways that they did it, that would be much more effective, quite frankly, than what I'm doing right now. So build that story. It doesn't mean that it's a Goldilocks and the 3 bears type story. You don't have to say once upon a time. It's not, and it's certainly not fictional. It's based in real data from your case. But you do want to have sort of a narrative flow to it, where there's some context, where you have a plot, you have a protagonist, you are building up to some sort of conclusion or resolution. That is very much the story format that you want to be using. And then make sure that you suggest some sort of resulting action. What would you do first, and when would you do it in order to achieve some expected outcomes? That's going to be important when analyzing your case. Not only do you have to understand what's happening in the case, but you have to be thinking about what are the resulting decisions that would be made or actions that would be taken based on my understanding of that case. And this is, again, where the 4 frames comes back into view, because you're trying to make decisions and create actions based on your understanding through Bowman and Deal's 4 frames of the structural human resource, political and symbolic. There are different case types that you're going to be encountering. There are more than these 3, but these are the big 3. The one that you'll see most frequently are decision-related cases. But let's start. How do I get rid of that? Let's start. There's a way to undo, and of course I can't think of it right now. Oh, here we go. So let's start with problems. Problems mean that there's a significant outcome or performance that has no explanation in the case. It's usually a, how do I put this politely, a negative or underperformance or an unexpected or unwanted outcome. It's rarely, people are doing better than we thought, but we don't know why. Although those do exist, but usually it's something's gone wrong, and we have to figure out what's happening because we don't know why it's happening. You want to then define the problem and search for the cause. Remember, we're talking about factors that lead to a particular result or outcome or performance or whatever it is. Using Bowman and Deal's 4 frames, you will see over here that I have a reminder that all cases must be analyzed using Bowman and Deal's 4 frames. That should be your lenses right now. So think of it as a set of 4 lensed eyeglasses that you've got on your face all the time, and you can look through each of those lenses, each of those 4 frames that Bowman and Deal set out for us to help try to understand what the problem is and what are the factors that are leading to that situation or outcome or performance or result or whatever it is that's described in the case. So search for that cause using Bowman and Deal's 4 frames. The next kind of case type is decision, focused primarily on an explicit decision that must be made. So as people who are often put in leadership situations, part of being in those kinds of situations or assuming the responsibility of those roles is making some sort of explicit decision that will usually lead to some sort of action and possibly consequence. Hopefully it's a good consequence. So you have to think about what are the explicit decisions that must be made or could be made. And what are some of the options and the criteria for coming to those recommended actions that you can find based on the evidence using Bowman and Deal's 4 frames? And then finally, a third type is evaluations. Evaluation cases assess a performance, act, or outcome. That could be a decision, for example. And then they define evaluative criteria using Bowman and Deal's 4 frames to explore the positive and negative sides. That's your responsibility now, is to use Bowman and Deal's frames to either identify the problems and the reasons for it, or the factors that lead to those problems, or to use Bowman and Deal's 4 frames to assemble the evidence, to find options and decision criteria in order to make an explicit decision, or to use Bowman and Deal's 4 frames to define a set of evaluative criteria that can assess a performance, act, or outcome in order for a decision to be made. So you won't see Bowman and Deal's 4 frames explicit in your cases. You put that in there. You are the ones that bring that to the party. So what are some of the things that we've just talked about? What do you need to do when you're looking at, in this case, we're going to use a decision-driven case as the example. Well, first of all, when you're reading and preparing, these are the steps that we just went through. You want to study the situation, that's the what and when. You want to develop hypotheses using Bowman and Deal's 4 frames, that's the why and how. You want to establish proof and action. Remember, proof is just another word for evidence and what sort of actions might come from that. And you want to be able to evaluate your hypotheses that you came up with using Bowman and Deal's 4 frames. Some of the actions that you can take are listed over here on the right. I would take a close look at those because those will help you understand what you're doing in each of these steps. So let's go one by one and start with studying the situation, the what and when. In a decision-driven case, the first thing you want to do is identify what are the decision options that are available in the case. It might say something like, she has 2 choices to make. One is expel, Roger. The other one is to whatever it is. So identify what the decision options available are that are both explicitly stated, as I just suggested with my silly example, or are implicitly stated. In other words, they aren't overtly stated or written down in the case, but you understand because of your expertise and experience that there are maybe 2 or 3 decision options that are available. Evaluate the strength of those different decision options. You might do that already sneaking ahead to use Bowman and Deal's 4 frames and thinking about how structurally, from a human resource perspective, a political perspective, or a symbolic perspective, each of those decisions has strengths. Also identify the risks of each of those options. Again, I would suggest using the 4 frames as a way to do that. Create criteria for evaluating each of those options using, shockingly, Bowman and Deal's 4 frames. And then try to identify the most important or most relevant criteria. One of the things you might consider is that your options itself might also include not doing anything at all. So one of your decisions could be to make no decision. So just keep that in mind as you move forward. Inaction is always an option. It's an action itself, quite frankly. Next, develop hypotheses using Bowman and Deal's frames. So you want to select the strongest criteria that you just came up with up here and evaluate your options, exposing the strengths and weaknesses for each option again. Focus on your most confident hypothesis options. So whether it's the symbolic, the human resource, the political, or the symbolic sort of frame that you're looking through, what is your most confident hypothesis? What do you really think is happening? Like which of these frames best explains the situation or best helps you deduce what's happening or come to some sort of resolution about that? And then consider that option from multiple viewpoints. In particular, try to think of it from the protagonist viewpoint. That's the main character in your case study, or from the critics of it. Who are always going to be the naysayers? Because you and I all know that life is not full of people who just say yes to everything and agree with everything, and often for good reason. Often people who disagree are not just being jerks about it. They're disagreeing because there are valid alternatives to whatever is happening. So consider those multiple viewpoints, and I would recommend trying to find at least 3 alternatives to the one you have. So, to make this just painfully obvious, if you were using Bowman and Deal and you decided that the human resource frame provided your most confident hypothesis, then you would want to think of alternatives from the structural, the political, and the symbolic point of view. Next, proof and action. Gather evidence about your top hypothesis, assess that option using data in the case, plus your own analysis. Identify actions given that data analysis, and create a statement of what you will do and when. I'm not usually asking for, a 10-page Gantt chart with all of the details that lay out how you'd plan this project. This isn't a project planning class. But I would like some understanding of what's the next step. What needs to be taken care of in, let's say, the short term at the least, and then think about how you might change that up in a year or 5 years or a month or 5 months or whatever your short, medium, and long term frames are. Finally, evaluate your hypotheses. Challenge your own chosen option. Find the biggest risks risks and downsides, because if you've been in a leadership position before, you know that there are not only people, but there are situations that will expose the risks and the downsides. And if you have not prepared for that, or sort of thought enough to get ahead of the curve a little bit, you will be blindsided and your decision will go down in flames. So describe how you will handle those risks and those downsides. Also, take some time to identify the strongest evidence against your own position, your own option. And then maybe even try to think for a second how you would advocate for a major alternative hypothesis using evidence from the case, or that you've analyzed, if you've analyzed some data further than what the case provides. In other words, you really want to set up a valid alternative to your own decision or your own result. Not saying that this is a choice you would choose, but you need to understand what the options are so that you can make the best possible decision. Maybe it's, one clear decision or one clear outcome is fantastic and all the others are horrible, and that's how you feel. Then you're going to have to put yourself in the shoes of somebody or an organization or life that might suggest that one of those things that you think is a horrible option is really the best possible option out there. And you want to think about what would they advocate for and how would they use data to do that. On the other hand, in the best possible world, it might be that you're choosing from all the best options. You're just trying to find the best of the best. Well, good for you if that's the case. But you still want to find what are the advantages, what are the reasons you might advocate for the alternatives that are good, but they aren't great. Finally, when you're writing and discussing your decision-driven case, in other words, when you're trying to analyze this, you want to always state your conclusion first. This might be a little different than the types of writing that you've done in the past, and so I wanted to highlight this and make it as clear as possible. State what you find the conclusion to be right off the bat. Please don't hide it in the end. Please don't, bury it under a lot of personal opinion or perspectives that don't have any evidence behind them. Just come out and say, this is what needs to happen. These are the critical reasons why this needs to happen. This is the data or evidence that says why this needs to happen. But start with a single sentence that states the decision or the outcome. This is a decision-driven case, remember, in a single sentence so that there's no question what that action will be. Being decisive as a leader is not always a bad thing, and so I'm going to ask you to be decisive here. Next, you want to make the case. Present the options you considered. We just did that, right? I just hammered that on the last slide, so I'm not going to hammer that again. Present the decision criteria you use to evaluate your options and explain how the criteria fit your recommended option in particular. Then you have to show how the same criteria did not support the other options and acknowledge the potential disadvantages and how you are going to address them. That's really important. I don't want you to stop by saying, yep, it all might stink. This might be the wrong decision, period, end of document. You need to acknowledge what might go wrong, but then spend a paragraph at least talking about how you're going to either try to minimize those disadvantages, eliminate those disadvantages, or avoid those disadvantages. Finally, come back around, state your recommended actions. So again, I'm not looking for a 10-page plan that's mapped out, in using Microsoft Project Planner. I'm asking for an understanding of what you would do very briefly, according to your conclusion, in the short, medium, and long term. Emphasis on how you start. That's going to be a big part of this because starting it is important. Finishing is important as well, but starting is especially important. And then defining your potential risks and how you would respond. So once you've made your case, you're saying it sort of again here in action format. This is how you analyze your case. Where is Bowman and Deal in this? Maybe that's where I should come back to. Bowman and Deal make a prominent appearance in the Make the Case section. And this is the the framework we're using to understand organizational leadership and change management in this course or in this seminar, or however you're interacting with this. So be sure that those 4 frames are present in your decision making, in the criteria, in your explanation, in your evidence that you're using. All of that needs to be related back to Bowman and Deal in this section explicitly. Okay, folks, if you've made it this far, you should feel pretty good about life. We are at the end of our discussion of how you approach a case and how you analyze your educational case study. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know by email, or you can talk to me in the seminar. I'm excited to see you soon, and take care.